The most momentous event that resulted in the suspected extinction of the Mafia was the Maxi trial in the early 1990s, during which 338 Mafia members were sentenced to a total of 2,665 years in prison, not counting the multiple life sentences given to the 19 Mafia bosses. After the trial, Mafia clans disbanded as many members went into hiding. The inactivity of the Mafia and legal expenses reduced most Mafiosi to abject poverty. Consequently, a frequently asked question that organized crime scholars get is whether the Sicilian Mafia is still active today. After the arrest, imprisonment, and murder of almost the entire last generation of prominent Mafia bosses, Messina Denaro is probably the only old generation Mafia boss alive that has never been in prison. Today's episode looks at the life and criminal exploits of the current supreme leader of the Sicilian Mafia, Messina Denaro, and how he has been able to elude arrest for over 3 decades. Matteo Messina Denaro was born in April 1962 in the Sicilian province of Trapani. His father, Francesco Messina Denaro, was the boss of the Castelvetrano Mafia clan and also the head of the Mafia in the Trapani region. From his teenage years, Denaro was groomed to be a Mafia boss. He learned to use a gun at age 14 and committed his first murder in 1980 when he was only 18. This marked the completion of his initiation into the Cosa Nostra. Shortly after that, Denaro started as an executioner for Corleonesi Mafia boss Salvatore Rina and a lieutenant of the Corleonesi underboss Bernardo Provenzano. Under the mentorship of the Corleonesi, Denaro became a ruthless assassin and is estimated to have killed at least 50 people during his early years. He is even said to have bragged about it during a conversation with a fellow mafioso. Denaro is reported to have said, "I filled a cemetery all by myself." His cold-bloodedness earned him the nickname Diabolic, from the Italian comic book character of the same name. Denaro rose to notoriety in the Cosa Nostra in 1993 when he murdered a rival mob boss, Vincenzo Milazzo, and strangled Milazzo's pregnant fiancée. Denaro is reported to have participated in the murder of the anti-mafia judge Giovanni Falcone after Falcone sentenced Rina and Absentia to life in prison. Denaro and fellow hitmen Giovanni Brusca and Leo Luca Bagarella planted 400 kilograms of explosives in a trench under Highway A29 between the Palermo International Airport and the town of Capaci. Falcone used this road every Saturday to get to his home for weekends. The hitmen watched the road from a small building on a hill and waited patiently for Falcone. On Saturday, May 23, 1992, the mobsters saw Falcone's car approaching the highway and detonated the bomb using a remote-controlled device. Falcone, his wife Francesca Movillo, and their 3 police escorts were blown into pieces. A month later, another prominent anti-mafia judge, Paolo Borsellino, was killed in a similar bombing. This forced the Italian government to introduce a new provision in the penal code, known as the carcere duro. By this law, people imprisoned for any mafia-related offenses are to serve their sentences in solitary confinement. Access to phones, receiving parcels, contacts with other inmates, and even family visits were strictly prohibited. The objective of this new provision was to prevent Rina and other arrested mafia bosses from coordinating mob activities from behind bars. In retaliation, Messina Denaro, Giovanni Brusca, Leo Luca Bagarella, and the other fugitive mafia bosses orchestrated a series of bomb attacks to pressure the Italian government to retreat. It started with the Via dei Giorgiofili bombing in Florence on May 27, 1993, resulting in 5 deaths and 48 injured. Messina Denaro also tailed Maurizio Costanzo, a television host who expressed delight at Rina's arrest. On May 14, 1993, an assassination attempt was made on the life of Costanzo, but he narrowly escaped. The blast injured 23 people on the streets of Rome. On July 27, 1993, the men carried out the Via Palestro bombing in Milan, killing 5 people and 20 injured. When Pope John Paul II tried to condemn the killings, Denaro and his men bombed the St. John Lateran Cathedral in Rome, leaving 10 people dead and 93 injured. Later in 1993, Santino Di Matteo, a Palermo mafioso arrested a year earlier, agreed to testify against Rina. In retaliation, Messina Denaro and Giovanni Brusca disguised in police uniforms and abducted Di Matteo's 11-year-old son Giuseppe. The boy was strangled and his body dissolved in a barrel of acid. After the 1993 bombings, Denaro went into hiding and has lived as a fugitive ever since. In 2002, he was sentenced in absentia to 19 years in prison for his role in the 1993 bombings. Denaro controls an extensive extortion racket in Trapani with a steady flow of protection money paid by business owners to his criminal empire. He is highly involved in drug trafficking and is allegedly in partnership with the Contrera Caruana Mafia clan. The Contrera Caruanas are the bankers of the Sicilian Mafia, dubbed the Rothschilds of the Cosa Nostra. Denaro also makes money from legitimate businesses. He has stakes in major Sicilian supermarket chains. He is allegedly in partnership with Giuseppe Grigoli, holder of the exclusive franchise for Western Sicily of the Spar supermarket chain. Denaro's family owns substantial sand quarries, through which he skims money off public construction contracts. He owns an olive oil production business that relies solely on underpaid illegal immigrant labor in his vast olive groves. After the natural death of his father in 1998, Denaro took over leadership of the mafia in the Trapani region and its surroundings. At the time, he had about 20 mafia families and almost 1,000 initiates under his command. The Trapani Mafia is considered the second most powerful faction of the Cosa Nostra, the first being the Palermo faction. By norm, a mafioso is expected to maintain a traditional family, comprising a breadwinning father, a homemaking mother, and their biological children. Members are expected to uphold core family values and treat their wives with respect. These standards were observed by all the old bosses, including Rina and Provenzano. However, Messina Denaro, the present boss, is quite the opposite. Denaro is known to be a ruthless playboy and womanizer. He drives expensive Porsche sports cars and wears Rolex Daytona watches, fancy Ray-Ban sunglasses, and flirty designer clothes from Giorgio Armani and Versace. He also has a reputation for entertaining sexual relations with young girls. He is alleged to have murdered a Sicilian hotel owner who reprimanded him for this behavior. Denaro had slept with one of the hotel receptionists. Therefore, he is remarkably different from traditional mafia bosses like Salvatore Rina and Bernardo Provenzano, who adhered to conservative family values. In 1995, the mafia underworld was shocked to learn that Denaro had fathered an illegitimate child with an ex-girlfriend, Francesca Anya, as children out of wedlock is very unusual for mafia bosses. The existence of the child became public knowledge following the interception of Denaro's letters by the police. Denaro had addressed the letter to a friend, complaining that he had never met his daughter. On March 15, 2010, Denaro's brother Salvatore Messina Denaro was arrested along with 18 others and convicted for coordinating Denaro's secret correspondence and managing his criminal empire while he remained on the run. On May 19, 2011, the police surrounded a farmhouse in Denaro's hometown, Castelvetrano. The Internal Security Agency had received an anonymous tip that the fugitive mafia boss had taken refuge at the manor. When the police closed in, there was no trace of Denaro. In 2012, he was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Giuseppe Di Matteo, the 11-year-old son of the mafioso witness whom he had abducted, strangled, and dissolved his body in acid back in the early 90s. On December 13, 2013, Denaro's sister Patrizia Messina Denaro was arrested for mafia association and extortion. She was sentenced to 14 years in prison. In December 2014, the Italian police came close to arresting Denaro after wiretaps had placed his possible location around his olive oil business in Trapani. Over 100 police officers executed search warrants around the area, but there was no sign of Denaro. An estimated $24 million worth of his assets were confiscated. In December 2017, a manhunt for Denaro was launched with a special unit of over 200 police officers. The men executed search warrants at 30 properties allegedly owned by other mafiosi in Castelvetrano, Denaro's hometown. Arrests were made and properties seized. Still, there was no sign of Denaro. In November 2018, organized crime investigators found evidence that Italian businessman Carmelo Patti had commercial ties with and was possibly laundering money for Denaro. About $1.7 billion worth of Patti's assets were seized by the Italian police. On August 12, 2021, law enforcement got hold of the first ever voice recording of Denaro. Before then, no one had any idea what he sounded like. However, it turned out to be a 28-year-old recording, made when Denaro testified back in March 1993 in the court of Marsala concerning a murder case. Finally, on September 10, 2021, Dutch television reported that Denaro had been arrested in a restaurant in The Hague. Dutch police had received a tip from Italian authorities about his presence in the Netherlands. The suspect was bundled to the floor, blindfolded, and immediately taken to the viewed maximum security prison, where he was detained. After 3 days of interrogations by Dutch prosecutors and DNA investigations, it was discovered that the man arrested wasn't Denaro after all. The man turned out to be Mark L., a British Formula One fan from Liverpool. Mark had traveled to Holland with his wife and son to attend the Dutch Grand Prix, a Formula One auto racing event held in Zandvoort, the Netherlands. After the Second Mafia War in 1983, Salvatore Riina became the capo dei capi, or boss of bosses, but he was apprehended 9 years later. The leadership of the Mafia passed on to Riina's right-hand man Leoluca Bagarella. He too was arrested just 2 years later. After Bagarella's arrest, Bernardo Provenzano became the head of the Mafia in Sicily. However, he held the position for only a year, as he too was swiftly apprehended in April 2006. Following Provenzano's arrest, Messina Denaro became the new boss of bosses. For over 15 years, the Italian government has been relentless in its effort to capture him, but to no avail. Almost all of his blood relatives, friends, and associates are incarcerated. We're talking of over 100 people who were closely connected to him. Denaro doesn't seem to be the most cautious mob boss. His reputation for fast living and multiple extramarital affairs makes him even more vulnerable than his conservative predecessors. But what really makes Messina Denaro invincible? Despite his flaws, Denaro has left almost no trail to follow. There is virtually no one alive today in the Mafia world who is in the position to testify against him for any of his crimes. He is known for not using any computers or cell phones. He prefers communicating with his associates by exchanging handwritten coded messages on tiny pieces of paper. Denaro is rarely seen by other mob bosses, let alone members of the general public. He doesn't attend any meetings or parties. The few existing photos of him were taken over 30 years ago when he was in his 20s. The images used by the police to track him down were generated by an age progression software using a picture on his driver's license issued in 1982 when he was only 20. Investigators are literally guessing what he would look like today in his late 50s. In addition to these preventative measures, Denaro's ability to evade arrest can be explained by his deep-rooted economic power. He controls enormous wealth and has close ties with the most elite members of the Sicilian aristocracy. Denaro is believed to have strong ties with prominent Sicilian business magnates who are known to be laundering his money. Between January 2008 and September 2010, the Italian government confiscated over $3.3 billion in assets from the supermarket magnate Giuseppe Grigoli and from construction tycoons Rosario Caschio, Francesco Pecora, and Vito Nicastri. In November 2018, the Italian government seized about $1.7 billion worth of Carmelo Patti's assets on suspicion that the businessman was laundering money for Denaro. These are literally the wealthiest men in Sicily, all alleged to be associates of Denaro's. Italian organized crime investigators have long claimed that Denaro is being shielded by influential Freemasons and top politicians in the Trapani region. Some have argued that if the Italian government has not been able to pin him down all these years, it's because he's got protection from the same government. Whether Denaro is getting protection from powerful people in the government is a speculation that is subject to debate. Please, in the next 10 seconds, let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you agree, type agree, and if you disagree, type disagree. Messina Denaro is referred to as the unchallenged boss of all bosses within the Sicilian Mafia. Some organized crime scholars have described him as the last man standing. It is believed that his arrest would result in the end of the Mafia in Sicily. Consequently, he is the most wanted man in Europe and the third most wanted person in the world. The origin of the Mafia in Sicily dates back to the 18th century, and even if it still exists, it is definitely not as active as it used to be. The decline of the Mafia started back in the late 1970s with the outbreak of the Great Mafia War. The slaying of prominent mafia figures by other mafiosi during the war diminished the overall prominence of the organization. The war recorded over 1,000 homicides and ended with the Maxi trial in 1986, during which 338 mafia members were sentenced to a total of 2,665 years in prison, not counting the multiple life sentences given to the 19 mafia bosses. The series of events that unfolded before, during, and after the Great Mafia Wars and the mass killings is covered in a separate video. Please check out our video on the Great Mafia Wars using the end screen that would appear towards the end of this video. Thank you for watching, and please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more videos on crime stories, notorious outlaws, and historical scandals.